I'm a 31-year-old woman, and for this discussion you can call me Gina. My husband, Greg, is 33 years old. We've been married for a decade and together for nearly 13 years. We have 2 children, a 9-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy. Before my affair, Greg was the only man I had ever been with, whereas he had 3 previous girlfriends before dating me. Our marriage was wonderful, filled with love, laughter, and family. Even though we had been married for many years, our intimacy was incredibly satisfying for both of us. Now here's where I messed everything up. I met a man, let's call him Rich, at my daughter's soccer practice. He was a parent of a 6-year-old girl who played in the league below my daughter's. Rich worked from home, which allowed him to attend soccer practices and games. Initially, I spoke to him as part of a group of parents, while we watched our children on the sidelines. The reason he stood out was that he was one of the few dads who were there during practices, which typically happened right after school. Over time, we started talking more often, and I noticed that he would always come over and stand near me at every practice, even when I was with other moms. These conversations led to an uncomfortable discussion where he confessed he had strong feelings for me. I made it clear that I was happily married and that we needed to stop talking. He respected my decision and backed off. Strangely, even though I rejected his advances, I found myself enjoying the attention. I know it was terribly wrong, but I want to be honest and share what I was feeling. Eventually, he brought up his feelings again and asked if I would meet him for coffee at a cafe in the neighboring town. Initially, I refused, but later I decided to meet him, with the understanding that it would be a one-time coffee meeting and nothing more. Looking back, I realized that just talking to him was a form of cheating and a complete disrespect to my husband and family, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. At the end of our private meeting, just before we left for our children's practice, he suggested that I come to his house the following day at the same time. He handed me a piece of paper with his home address. I initially declined, but he gently kissed me, and I'm ashamed to admit that not only did I kiss him back, but I kissed him again when he pulled away. The next day, we met at his house and engaged in an affair. There was no conversation or build-up. We just went ahead with it. As I looked around and saw photos of his beautiful wife and child, I became deeply upset with myself. Thoughts of Greg and my kids overwhelmed me, and I burst into tears, telling Rich that I couldn't continue this. We cleaned up, got dressed, and left in our separate cars for our children's practice. During the following week, I made an effort to avoid Rich at soccer practice. When I finally did speak to him again, I firmly told him that I wanted no further contact with him. In response, he handed me a note containing the name and address of a hotel in the same neighboring town. He mentioned that he wanted me to meet him there the next day at our usual time, but understood if I chose not to. I simply said, "No, I can't," and left. That night, I stayed awake, contemplating how this situation could destroy my marriage and family if it ever came to light. However, I foolishly believed the risk was low since we never communicated through calls or texts. All our interactions were verbal or through handwritten notes. I had no intention of going, but I eventually gave in and met him. Similar to our first encounter, it ended with me in tears, telling Rich that we couldn't continue this. This time he agreed, but he believed our intimate moments were worth the risk. We parted ways and remained apart for a whole month, with no contact except for brief conversations during soccer practice and games when talking to other parents. What's most troubling is that during one of the games, my husband Greg and Rich ended up chatting for over 20 minutes. It made me feel terrible, but in a twisted way, it also excited me for some reason. Fast forward to my D-Day, the day my husband discovered my affair, the absolute worst day of my life, already crying. Rich and I had a conversation at soccer practice the day before and came to an agreement that we shouldn't meet anymore. We were both happily married and loved our spouses and children. However, here's where I made a really terrible mistake. We decided to meet one final time. I know some people here might find it hard to believe, but it's the truth. D-Dav was supposed to be our last meeting, didn't want to meet at Rich's house because I couldn't bear to see the photos of his wife and child. So I suggested that he come to my home instead. The plan was for him to park on the nearby street, walk over to my house, and enter through the side door, where I would let him in. Since it was lightly raining and there was no one on the street, I thought he did so without Anvo noticing. I took him to our home office on the second floor, which has a guest bed, and that's where we met. I want to emphasize that I would never have done anything in our marital bed like we did at Rich's house because I have too much love and respect for my husband. Since this was going to be our final encounter, there was a lot of kissing and foreplay before the actual intimate act. I'm not sure what came over Rich, but he suddenly panicked and attempted to rush past Greg, who was blocking the door. Greg is quite tall, standing at over 6 feet and weighing nearly 230 pounds, whereas Rich is around 5 feet 10 inches and weighs only about 160 pounds. As a result, Rich bounced off Greg and fell backward to the floor. Undeterred, he got back up and tried to charge at Greg, but this time Greg took a step forward and forcefully pushed him back. The force of the push sent Rich flying backward, causing him to collide with one of the window screens and fall out of the window, landing on a large bush in front of our house. It was shocking because he was completely unclothed. I was in tears and pleaded with Greg to stop, fearing that he would harm Rich, and I didn't want Greg to face legal trouble. In response, Greg gave me a hostile look and hastily went downstairs. I was concerned he might physically harm Rich and was anxious about my husband's legal situation. I watched from the window, wrapped in a blanket, and saw Rich still lying unclothed in the bush, trying to free himself. I could see that he had scratches and was bleeding, although it didn't seem to be a serious injury. Greg emerged from the house holding Rich's cell phone and began shouting at Rich, demanding his passcode. Rich began begging for mercy, pleading with Greg not to hurt him and not to call his wife Kate. Greg became angry and threatened Rich, saying, "Give me the damn code or there will be consequences." In response, Rich quickly provided the code and Greg entered it into the phone. Greg then made a call to Kate, introducing himself and explaining the situation. He told her he was standing there with her husband, who he had just caught in an intimate act with his wife. After some more discussion and reassurance, he provided Kate with our address and ended the call. I noticed our next-door neighbor coming over. He asked Greg if everything was okay. Greg replied that it wasn't, but he'd manage. Greg thanked him for alerting him to the situation and explained that he had caught us in the act. Our neighbor mentioned that he suspected something was amiss when he saw a man lurking around outside our house. Initially, he thought it might be a burglary until he saw me answering the door and letting the man in. The neighbor felt compelled to call Greg. Greg informed the neighbor that he intended to contact the police to report the incident. Upon hearing this, Rich began to cry and begged Greg not to involve the police. At that point, Rich was still unclothed and trembling. I called down to Greg, pleading with him not to call the police, but he paid no attention and made the call. The police arrived within a few minutes. Greg and our neighbor met the officer at the curb and had a discussion for several minutes, gesturing toward the neighbor's house and then up to our office window. They then proceeded to the bush where Rich was, huddled over, crying, and still unclothed. The officer asked Greg if he could retrieve Rich's clothes, and Greg agreed to do so. When I heard Greg open the door, I rushed to the top of the stairs, crying and expressing how sorry I was and how much I loved him. However, he didn't look up. He simply gathered Rich's clothes and shoes from the floor and stairs and returned outside. The officer took the clothing from Greg and handed them to Rich, who clumsily got dressed. Rich was hyperventilating and still shaking intensely at this point. I had never witnessed someone in such a state and realized it was likely due to a combination of nervous fear, shock, and the cold, as it was around 55 degrees outside. I stood by the window while the officer questioned Rich, but they couldn't see me due to the window screens we have. The officer instructed Rich to calm down and relax, which he eventually managed to do. Rich took responsibility for what happened, admitting it was all his fault. He provided an honest account of the situation, explaining that he charged at Greg because he just wanted to get away from there. The officer asked whether Greg's action of pushing him was defensive or offensive, to which Rich responded that it was defensive. I felt relieved that Rich didn't falsely accuse Greg. Before long, a group of neighbors had gathered in front of our house. The neighbor who had alerted Greg was explaining the situation to them. I was deeply embarrassed and couldn't help but cry even harder. Now, returning to the police officer and Rich. The officer inquired if Rich wanted to press charges, but Rich declined, expressing his desire to leave and promising never to disturb our family again. Shortly after, Rich's wife Kate arrived in front of our house. My husband went out to meet her and they had a brief conversation. Rich rushed over to her, crying and apologizing, but she didn't acknowledge him. The officer spoke to Kate, and I could faintly hear her saying that she wanted Rich to stay away from her. The officer then instructed Rich to step back, which he did, and he started sobbing uncontrollably. The officer had a conversation with Greg and Kate for a few minutes before entering the house to talk to me. He called up the stairs and asked if I could come down and have a conversation with him. I agreed, but requested a minute to get dressed. The officer then took my statement, and towards the end of our conversation, he mentioned that my husband had requested that I voluntarily leave the home. I told the officer that I didn't want to leave, and that I needed to discuss this with my husband. The officer understood my feelings, but explained that it might be best if I left, at least for the night, to allow things to settle down. I broke into tears, and the officer asked if there was someone I could call. I told him yes, my parents. Almost immediately, I heard my mom on the porch talking to Greg. When I saw her expression, I simply said, "Mom, I'm sorry, I messed up really badly." The officer then explained to my mom that it would be advisable for me to stay with her for a few days until things calmed down. I went upstairs with my mom to pack my things. She didn't say anything while I packed, but I could tell she was upset, embarrassed, and deeply disappointed in me. Once my mom and I came downstairs and went outside, only the officer was there, along with several neighbors who were still on the sidewalk talking. The officer informed us that Greg had gone to pick up the kids from school and would be taking them to practice, followed by dinner. He mentioned that Greg had requested that I close and lock the door, and he, Greg, would get in touch with me in a few days to talk. Upon returning to my parents' house, both Mom and Dad reprimanded me for ruining my marriage. I simply apologized and expressed my determination to regain Greg's trust. My dad, however, told me that it was unlikely to happen and that I should start preparing for a divorce. This news brought me to tears, and Mom asked him why he would say such a thing. He responded bluntly, "Because it's true." Over the next 2 days, I sent texts and called Greg repeatedly, but he didn't respond. Then, on Wednesday evening, he sent a text suggesting that we meet on Saturday morning at our house to discuss our next steps. In that same text, he mentioned that he had already talked to our kids about what happened, and I couldn't believe he had done this without me. I feared that our kids might now despise me. In another text message, Greg informed me that he had pressed charges against Rich and obtained a 30-day restraining order, TRO. I disliked hearing this news because I just wanted this nightmare to be over. To make matters worse, the incident had been reported in the police section of our local newspaper. Although it didn't mention names or our house number, it did reveal our street name and made it clear what had occurred. Saturday arrived, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about seeing Greg again. My dad and Mom drove me to our house and stayed on the porch as Greg and I met inside. I told them they could leave, but Greg insisted on them staying, as he didn't trust being alone with me. Sigh. When I approached him for a hug, he held up his hands to keep me at a distance. We sat down and he handed me separation papers. I broke down in tears and pleaded with him, saying, "No, please don't do this." I continued to beg and express how deeply sorry I was and that I loved him, only him. However, he responded with a firm no and began explaining the contents of the separation papers. Despite my continued pleas, he kept on explaining the details of how the separation would work. He mentioned that I could move back into the house, but I would be staying in the office, which would remain as it was when I left. He then talked about splitting our bank accounts evenly and dividing the equity in the house in case it was ever sold. However, he emphasized that he wanted me to waive any claim to his 401k retirement account. He went on to explain that starting the following month, I would be responsible for contributing 35% of our living expenses, which included the mortgage, insurance, utilities, car payments, groceries, and so on. Given that I didn't have a job, I would need to pay him this amount for my share of the savings. He made it clear that all of these terms were spelled out in the separation agreement and advised me to consult with a lawyer to review it. I expressed my reluctance to involve a lawyer and reiterated my desire to talk to him about our relationship. But he calmly but firmly stated that there was nothing left to discuss and that he just wanted to officially separate from me. He also clarified that he would only communicate with me regarding matters related to our children or when our children were present during the conversation. Anything else I said would be disregarded. With tears in my eyes, I asked if he planned to divorce me, to which he replied, "Right now, that's my plan." I told him I couldn't imagine living without him and that I was willing to fight with all my strength to keep our relationship intact. He simply stared at me with disgust and burst into loud laughter. Following that, he called my parents into the room and put his parents on speakerphone, explaining everything he had just told me to both sets of parents. It felt like a business meeting, but for me, it was sheer torment. All I could do was apologize to Greg. This all unfolded earlier today, and now I find myself here in the office, writing this post at 1:44 a.m. because I can't sleep. When I talked to my sister earlier, she gave me some valuable advice and suggested I post here to see if any readers might offer additional suggestions that could be helpful. So here I am, seeking guidance. What should I do? Have I irreparably damaged my marriage? Is there any hope of reclaiming the beautiful life I destroyed? Or is it lost forever? I welcome all responses, even the critical ones. Right now, I feel like an outcast with no one to turn to. My sister has been supportive, although she too is disgusted with my actions. Thank you in advance for taking the time to read this and for any replies you may offer. Gina. A lot has transpired in my life since my last update. Firstly, I want to express my gratitude to everyone who responded to my original post. Reading all the responses provided me with some solace, even though many of them were highly critical of my behavior. From my own experience, I can attest that not every story has a happy ending. In fact, some endings are truly heartbreaking. Greg and I are now officially divorced, and just typing those words brings tears to my eyes. I still can't fully grasp the reality of it all. It feels like a never-ending nightmare. If you recall from my initial post, my husband and I were living together in our home despite being legally separated. In the beginning, things were distant and cold between us, but over the first month, Greg gradually started warming up. He began talking to me more, even sharing laughter and jokes with me and the kids. I felt optimistic about our progress and believed that if we continued on this path, we could reconcile. Then, unexpectedly, 4 months into our separation, Greg expressed the desire to have a private conversation with me, without the kids. I thought it might be a discussion about taking the next steps towards reconciliation, but to my shock, he told me he wanted a divorce. I was utterly devastated. I know the term devastated is used frequently in these posts, but I can assure you that I truly felt that way. Greg clarified that while he would always have deep care for me as the mother of our 2 beautiful children, the love, passion, and trust he once had for me had vanished. I did everything I could to change his mind, but his decision was final. We hugged, but it didn't feel like the embrace of a husband and wife. It was more like 2 friends. Since we had been separated for nearly 4 months and had already agreed on the division of assets and custody in our separation agreement, the divorce process proceeded swiftly and was finalized in February of this year. Greg treated me fairly. He bought out my equity share in our home and even gave me an additional $10,000 to ensure I could provide a stable home for our kids. Despite having a decent sum of money from the divorce, it wasn't enough to buy a home or sustain me for the rest of my life. So I ended up taking a job at a new donut franchise conveniently located down the street from our kids' school. I knew the woman who owned the franchise, so I reached out to her about a job, and she hired me on the spot. Despite what you might assume, I genuinely enjoy working there. The owner is incredibly kind and understanding, my colleagues are fantastic, and our customers are extremely friendly. Sometimes I wish I had taken this job while I was married. Perhaps things wouldn't have turned out the way they did. You know the saying, an idle mind is the devil's playground or something like that. Well, I can't change the past. Contrary to what you might think, I love working there. The owner is very nice and understanding, my coworkers are awesome, and our customers are super friendly. I kind of wished I had gotten a job while I was married, as maybe things wouldn't have turned out like they have. How does the saying go? An idle mind is the devil's playground, or something like that. Oh well, I can't change the past. It's clear that Greg and Kate were involved with each other during our separation. Rumor has it they began their relationship shortly after D-Day. But since we live in a no-fault state, it doesn't really matter. Unlike Greg and me, Kate decided to divorce Rich promptly. Their divorce was finalized months before ours, mainly because the house they lived in was a gift to her, and they didn't have much in savings. As for Rich, it's a tragic story. He was deeply affected by the divorce, and on Halloween of last year, he got arrested for a DUI. Apparently, it was his second offense. Kate used this to gain full custody of their daughter, and now Rich only has supervised visitation, which takes place at Kate's parents' house because Greg and Kate don't want to see him, and Rich is afraid of Greg. I heard all of this through gossip. I find it both unfair and unkind for Kate to take these actions against her child's father, even though she may have strong negative feelings towards him. However, I understand her motivations behind what she did. Kate and her daughter are currently residing with Greg and my children in what used to be my house. Although it's no longer technically my house, I still think of it that way. This whole situation is really disheartening, and I try my best not to dwell on it, though it's a constant presence in my mind. I attempt to convince myself that what's happening with Kate is just a passing phase for Greg, much like the phase I went through with Rich. Kate is young and attractive. She's 26, so she's like a new distraction for Greg. Given the stressful circumstances that brought them together, I doubt their love is genuine. Nonetheless, I still hold on to the hope that Greg and I will eventually reunite. In the meantime, I genuinely wish him and Kate all the best. Recently, I received news that my contact with Greg will be further limited. He informed me that we will only communicate about our kids via email, starting this Wednesday. Greg mentioned that Kate has been communicating with Rich in the same manner, and he wants to do the same. Hearing this was another blow for me. I believe Kate must have influenced this decision, as Greg wouldn't cut me off like this on his own. As for myself, I've been dedicating most of my time to decorating my new apartment and making it a comfortable space for my kids. It only has 2 bedrooms, so things are a bit tight, but we're managing. I wish I could go back and change the past, but that's not possible. So I'm focused on moving forward, one small step at a time. This is where I currently stand. Thanks for taking the time to read this. All right, that was a fun story. Now let's move on to another exciting one. Stay tuned and let's dive in. I met my wife when I was 16 years old, but we tied the knot when we were both 21, and we welcomed our daughter at 22. Now we're both 47. The day I discovered her infidelity was rather unusual. I woke up that morning feeling unwell. I nearly considered calling in sick to work, but instead I went in, although I ended up leaving early. In hindsight, I'm grateful I left work early that day. My wife also had a job. I can't help but wonder if it was something I ate the night before or some random illness. By the way, she was an excellent cook, probably the only thing she excelled at now that I think about it. One significant warning sign that I completely overlooked was her best friend Kay, who happened to be single and frequently changed partners. She would share her escapades with my wife, and yet my wife would assert that she could never live that kind of lifestyle and expressed her happiness in marriage and family life. Ironically, Kay, her best friend, had even been involved with my wife's college boyfriend. But this was her closest friend. The company you keep says a lot about you. It wasn't until I discovered her cheating that I truly understood who my wife was. So that morning, feeling unwell, I headed to work. After having some coffee, I felt a bit better, but the waves of nausea persisted. I clocked out at lunchtime, and before heading home, I stopped to get some medication, hoping it would help me sleep off this ailment. My wife was supposed to be at work as well. She had prepared for her workday that morning, and I typically left for work before her. However, she was getting ready as though she was heading to the office. As I pulled into our building, it's worth noting that we were renting a townhome that shared a wall with another unit. I had to maneuver around to reach the parking lot, and I noticed my wife's car parked there, along with another car in the neighbor's spot. I thought maybe he had a visitor, but then I wondered why his car was missing. And why was my wife's car here? Finding no parking space, I decided to pull out and parked on the street in front of our building. As I approached the door, I heard incredibly loud music blasting. Initially, I thought it might be the neighbors, but I soon realized it was coming from our unit. From the front of the unit, I could see our bedroom window, and the music was definitely emanating from there. Upon entering, my suspicions were confirmed. Music was playing inside our place. Hastily, I climbed the stairs, opened the bedroom door, and there it was. My wife was engaging in physical activity with a guy, who I later discovered was her boss, while her best friend was hugging the man. Over the music, I shouted, "What the hell?" My wife swiftly dismounted the guy, her boss, and implored me to calm down, addressing me as, "Honey, please stop." Enraged, I shoved my wife aside and proceeded to physically confront the guy. Her best friend joined in the altercation, landing a solid punch to my nose. Although it wasn't broken, I needed medical attention to set it straight. Attempting to sue her and her boss for their involvement with my wife is another complicated story, far from the simplicity of internet advice. My wife and her best friend started brawling amongst themselves, creating an utterly chaotic scene. When I look back on it now, I still can't believe the absurdity of the situation. I turned off the music and ordered the guy to get out of my house, which he did hastily, even fleeing partially unclothed. However, when I went to another room to check out the window, he had managed to put his pants on and was rushing to his car downstairs. Returning to the room where my wife and her friend were arguing, her friend urged my wife to come clean and tell me the truth before she did. My wife remained silent, gazing at her friend. Eventually, her friend revealed that this was their lifestyle, and my wife had joined her in this business 3 years ago when I lost my job. I was laid off while my wife retained her job during that period. I was receiving unemployment benefits, but losing that significant portion of our income made things quite challenging for us. She mentioned that my wife approached her for financial help, and she suggested my wife could join her in her line of work. I inquired about the nature of this profession, but she implied I already knew. I insisted that I didn't and had never really paid attention, only recognizing that she was often with different guys whenever I saw her. She clarified that men paid her for her services, primarily for dates and conversations. I interrupted, asking, "So, you're an S-worker?" She just stared at me. I turned to look at my wife, but she kept her head down. Subsequently, I left the house and drove over to a nearby family's home, where I divulged everything: divorce plans, STD/STI testing, and paternity testing. My daughter was the only option, and with the support of a close family member, I was able to find a divorce attorney. He assisted with the initial expenses, although I later repaid him despite his assurance that I needn't worry about it. After visiting my doctor for a checkup, I received a clean bill of health, and the paternity test confirmed my beautiful daughter was indeed mine. I attempted to pursue a lawsuit for alienation of affection, a concept I wasn't even aware of until my lawyer mentioned it. Her boss contested the claims, asserting that he was not responsible for our marital troubles. My wife sided with him, asserting that our marriage had been deteriorating long before her involvement with him. To cut a long story short, the lawsuit was dropped, and I was unable to sue him. Given our financial constraints and my primary focus on obtaining a divorce, that became my main priority. Consequently, both my ex-wife and her boss were terminated from their jobs. I suspect that my ex-wife may have continued working as an S-worker, but it seems unlikely that anyone would want her services now. It appears she may want her husband back at this point. Our daughter's wedding isn't the first occasion when she expressed her longing for me. On a previous occasion, we were all gathered with my daughter, making some plans, when my ex-wife suddenly mentioned, "Oh my gosh, I remember our honeymoon. We stayed at a hotel near a concert and it was so much fun." I deliberately avoided acknowledging her statement, hoping to steer clear of that topic, but she went on saying, "We used to be so happy, but I had to go and ruin everything." I continued ignoring her, and soon enough, tears welled up in her eyes. My daughter was just observing her mother and asked what was bothering her. My ex-wife confessed that she had ruined her own life and felt like she had nothing. She expressed how she was trying to communicate but felt like no one was listening to her. She pleaded with my daughter to promise that she would do whatever it takes to keep her own family together and not repeat her mistakes. I struggled to suppress my laughter, but I couldn't hold it in entirely, and both my daughter and ex-wife turned to look at me. I quickly excused myself to the restroom where I couldn't help but burst into laughter. I couldn't believe this woman. I even poked fun at myself while looking in the mirror. After composing myself, I returned to the main room and we resumed our planning. On the day of my daughter's wedding, my ex-wife told me she missed me. She mentioned that being at our daughter's wedding brought back memories of the love we once shared and the family we had. She expressed regret over her actions that led to the downfall of our family and hoped that one day I could find it in my heart to forgive her. She attempted to cry on my shoulder, but I gently pushed her away, telling her not to ruin my suit. Then, I went back inside to celebrate my daughter's special day. My daughter wanted us both to take pictures together, so I did it for her sake. Honestly, I can't stand being around this woman, but she always seems to find her way to me. I tried mingling with others, making sure everyone was fine, but when I turned around, she was right there behind me. I asked her politely, "Can you please step away?" She held onto my shoulder and pleaded, "Please listen to me, please." My daughter's cousins were watching us, and I could tell they were embarrassed by their aunt, just like I would be. Eventually, we went back outside. I shouted at her, "What do you need?" She told me she had to undergo surgery for an issue with her reproductive system, some kind of cyst, and reassured me she would be okay. She said she felt alone and asked if I could take care of her during the week she'd be recovering at home since our daughter would be abroad that month. I expressed my sympathy for her situation and wished her well, but I made it clear that I couldn't take care of her. She started crying again and held on to me, but I gently pulled away. She asked, "So you won't be there for someone you used to love? The mother of your child?" I replied, "No." Then, I inquired about her best friend Kay, and she informed me that Kay was in a psychiatric hospital due to pills problems that had messed up her brain. She seems to be facing a lot of problems now, and she even attempted harm to a family member who tried to support her. I responded with a simple, "Oh," and turned to go back inside. Right after that, my ex-wife left. I noticed her talking to our daughter before leaving, wiping tears from her face. But that wasn't the end of it. She managed to convince our daughter that I was a terrible person for not helping her during her surgery week. Our daughter got angry and upset, thinking she might have to cancel her trip and lose the money she'd already spent on it. I have no intention of taking care of that woman ever. She should arrange for professional nursing care or something like that. It's not my responsibility. I'm not surprised at all by my ex-wife's friend Kay and her pills problem. I recall telling my ex-wife before that I suspected Kay was using something, and I meant it. She always had this hyper demeanor and sometimes seemed jittery, but my ex-wife used to insist that it was just her usual behavior.